Hello, all, and welcome to that InboxArmy podcast. I'm your host, Scott Cohen, VP of Marketing and Strategy here. And with me, as always, is Garen Hobbs. Welcome, Garen.
Thank you, Scott.
And today we're going to be talking about a crucial topic in email marketing that, let's face it, nobody really wants to think about unless it's necessary. But it is necessary. Of course, we're talking about email deliverability. It is a complicated beast. So we're here to try to demystify this as much as possible. And frankly, rather than me trying to pretend I know what I'm doing, we went out and got one of the foremost experts on the topic. Joining us today is LB Blair, Head of Deliverability and Managing Partner at Email Industries. Welcome to the show, LB.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, Scott. And you're really too kind with your introduction. I honestly, I just kind of, as you were saying, nobody wants to think about deliverability. The reason I got into it is I worked the overnight shift at IBM for their marketing cloud, and it was the thing nobody really wanted to deal with. And like we didn't have deliverability people all night. Sometimes we had a huge presence in Australia, so I honestly just started reading on it because it was the stuff like everybody's like, that's Deliv, somebody else will have to deal with it. And I was like, well, maybe I'll just crawl in this rabbit hole a little bit. And yeah, now like almost 10 years later, here I am.
It's like, similar story to me. Once email gets their hooks in you, you just never, it just never leaves. It never leaves. Well, to paraphrase The Princess Bride, let's go back to the beginning. There is a technical, you're here, email ecosystem expert. Let's talk about that ecosystem. When I press send from my email provider, what happens?
So canonical deliverability answer is it depends, but it depends a bit on how your email provider is built. But in general, you're interacting with the user interface of the application. So when you press send, that triggers, the application to put together whatever element. So if we're talking about like a bulk send or something, you're doing Klaviyo, Salesforce Marketing Cloud, it's going to go at the application level. It's going to communicate with its databases, pull any relevant personalization data, and it's going to, pair and prepare the HTML file and all the mail packets. And then, or it's going to prepare the send, and then it's going to pass it to the MTA, which is the message transfer agent. And that's really what I like to call the send engine. That's what does the business of pushing the mail out the door. So then once you've, the send engine queues those up and make sure to respect all the different connection rates that the various different mailbox providers expect, because Gmail is not the same as Comcast, is not the same as Hotmail, is not the same as Yahoo. They all have, some like different connection rates and different ways they approach this. And the MTA really manages all of that. Well, the MTA and the MTA engineers that work on them manage all of that and keep it tuned so that things are being submitted. And then basically it's, either you're going to get a 250 OK success response. That's the SMTP success response. And that means your message for that subscriber has been accepted, or you're going to get some kind of bounce back, like a 400 something, 500 something saying, hey, either that's not a good email address, or their mailbox is full, or you've been blocked due to policy, whatever reasons. Though there are obviously exceptions. Sometimes you can get a bounce that comes back after you've gotten a delivery. But really, once the packet, once the MTA does that handshake with the mailbox provider and passes them the mail packet, it's really in their hands. So from there, we don't know as much about what happens. That's why we have open tracking pixels. That's why we have click tracking servers and links to make sure we get any visibility into what happens to the mail once it's been passed to the mailbox provider. Because really, we don't know. They don't tell us. Gmail doesn't tell you this much of your mail landed in spam, this much landed in the inbox, none of that. So we really have to kind of proxy or intuit any of that based on different other data sources.
Interesting. And you mentioned mail packets. I mean, is that just a fancy name for the emails going through, or is there something more technical to that?
Yeah, there's something a little more technical, just insofar as I mean, it's SMTP connection, but actually you're not just passing the HTML, you're passing an MIME message body, which supports numerous different types. So, you've probably heard numerous deliverability professionals tell you, hey, it's best practice to have a text body and an HTML body. Those are separate those are both delivered within the MIME message packet. And you can even do an AMP message body now. You could have 3 different message bodies so that providers that support accelerated mobile pages like Google, because I think they developed it, they basically, you can send those different type of bodies, and the mail client, if it accepts the mail, will display the one that either the user has the preference for or that they decide is going to result in the best experience.
Got it. I'm really happy we're having this conversation. Demystification is certainly the right term. I think at this point we've probably already dropped at least a half a dozen acronyms, right? SMTP,
yeah,
MIME,
yeah.
MTA. Do you remember when people used to call MTAs mail cannons? I don't know, maybe that's just me and I've been in this industry too long, but
I call them that or send engine, but basically, I think of it almost as like the MTA is like what pushes the little baby birds out of the nest. Like your mail provider, helps you and the mail provider make the eggs, hatch the eggs, make sure they're ready to leave the nest, and then the MTA is what kind of pushes them out of the nest into the wild.
yeah. Deliverability kind of strikes me as being similar to high finance, and the fact that a lot of people view it as something very scary, unknown, it's arcane, it's full of all these things that I couldn't possibly know, so I'm just going to decide not to. It's a great inspiration for ostrich syndrome, right? Bury your head in the sand, pretend it's not there until you absolutely can't ignore it any longer. So for these folks, I'd like to take a big step back and really kind of explore the why of deliverability, right? So I'd love to ask you, LB, why do ISPs care about what lands in your inbox? Like, what is their vested interest? I mean, Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, they're great, but these aren't exactly organizations driven by altruism. So what is the stake in game for them?
Oh, absolutely. So, I will say I would quibble a little bit. While the organization, and their business goal obviously is to produce value for the shareholders, there are, a lot of people that work in anti-spam are in it for altruistic reasons. Like either they had a bad experience or they had a friend or family member, especially elderly family members are especially targeted by phishing scams, virus scams, things like that. You think about it, you got a significant elderly population, in the US and around the world, and in a lot of cases they have a lot, they've got their retirement nest egg, and then of course you've got people that are trying to separate them from that. And email, like 80% or more of all hacking attempts originate via email. Honestly, like 80% or more of all hacking, scam, malicious actor, attacks originate with email, whether it's an infected document trying to put, a Trojan horse on your computer, or, malware that's, something that's going to mine Bitcoin for them, whatever, or just email everyone in your contact list to propagate itself. Or scam people out of it. So, I mean, honestly, they're trying to protect their users against having a bad experience because they know that's crucial to maintaining the eyeballs. Because let's make no mistake, Google is a marketing services company by and large. They are a marketing software and services company. And they really have, I feel like they took a very different approach to spam filtering than has previously been taken because, really, and I think this is still pretty true, Microsoft and Yahoo in many ways, they look at the IP address because that's the first thing you see connecting in. Like, what IP address is this thing coming from? What do I think of its reputation, etc. So if you make the decision there to like not accept the mail, that's the cheapest possible way to filter spam because you're just like, I spent as minimal processing on this. Because you got to think, Gmail receives, I think, billions perhaps messages a day, I would assume. And because there's everything we see that actually reaches the inbox or the spam folder, that's just the tip of the iceberg there's a bunch of other mail that they block. So they're receiving all this mail. And what they're really trying to do is honestly just curate and protect the user experience so that the users stay with the mail, stay using their products. Because otherwise, if I'm on Gmail and I get hacked left, right, and center, or I get a gazillion phishing emails, if I have a bad experience, I'm really likely to jump ship as a user. I think, and with a product like that, with consumer products, it's almost, like somebody goes to a fast food restaurant, they have a bad time, and they never go back, right?
Yeah.
It could be like that. Your customers might just leave, or your users might just leave, and then that diminishes Google's value to their advertising customers. So I think that's a big part of it. And I mean, also, the more, if they just let viruses come into their system, malicious mail come into their system, there's a chance they get infected, which would be very costly. I mean, the other thing I would say too is, when you're receiving billions of messages a day, perhaps, you got to think about it. When you put something in the inbox versus the spam folder, or versus rejecting it, you're storing that message for that user indefinitely, pretty much. That adds up over time. That adds up when you have millions of users. I think Google has over 300 million, monthly active accounts. So when you have millions of users receiving millions of emails, you multiply those together, and it's a lot of storage space. So I think part of it is also just expense management. But I really think more than anything, spam filters are risk management systems. I think they're managing the risk that the user has a bad experience in their email client.
Yeah, I heard this morning, literally, somebody said 99% of email gets blocked these days.
Oh, yeah.
So the 1% that gets through, and you think about how much gets through, and you go, that's just 1%?
Yeah.
Dear God, that's a lot of email. So it's, well, I mean, let's talk about the various filters and pieces and forms and functions that all these providers have been putting in place. Authentication is kind of, it's one of the topics du jour, right? I mean, with the February 1st changes, a lot of acronyms there too, but it's much better in trying to talk them out. But walk us through, if you can. I mean, people are going to go, oh my God, I need to get SPF, DKIM, and DMARC set up, and they just don't know what those are. So, I'd love to just, almost like a primer. What are these, and what are the differences, and what do people need to do?
Yeah, no, totally. And I will try, in the spirit of demystifying, I will try to make this a bit less technical, just because I've seen too much. I've delved like the, the dwarves that delve deep into the mines of Moria, just to make sure, people know that they're dealing with a nerd here. I'll drop that reference. I've seen too much, but really I've got a simple way to kind of explain each of these. As SPF is Sender Policy Framework. It's really simple. It is just the list of servers, and there's a few different ways you can reference them, but it's a way of authorizing servers to send on behalf of your domain. It's basically the foundational thing, and the reason that there's a big focus on authentication is, if you can adjust the DNS records for a domain, functionally you own it. Like, that is the test of ownership. And we know this based on the fact that Google and Klaviyo and several other platforms require you to publish just a simple text record that won't interfere with anything, to set up things like Google Analytics or Google Postmaster tools, or, even authenticating your domain with, a mailbox provider, or with an email platform. They're going to ask you to put a text record, because that proves you own the domain. So if we take that, if you own the domain and you can adjust the DNS records, you can publish an SPF record, which says, hey, these services, which ultimately boil down to the IP addresses of the servers involved, but there's a variety of different ways of referencing them that, honestly, SPF can be one of the most difficult to get right. Like, it can be very complicated, especially one thing I've seen that's really changed since I got in the game early on, to now, is you can have like a small to medium sized sender, somebody just in the low tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of messages, that have you know, 5, 6 or more services that need to authenticate and send on behalf of their domain. And then you got to cram all that into one SPF record, which is why I think like subdomain strategy is so important, like splitting out your mail streams and making it easier. So that's SPF is very simply, I call it the guest list, the allow list. It's these folks are authorized to represent my sending domain in the email channel. DKIM is a bit more complicated in that it essentially secures your messages against man-in-the-middle attacks. I remember early on in the days of e-commerce, one of the big worries people would have is like, oh no, what if I, click a link and it turns out it's to a spoof site, or somebody injected a malicious link and then I put my payment in on that, then I've been scammed, right? DKIM helps protect against that. It makes sure the mail has not been tampered in transit, and it uses public private key encryption. So the private key at the server zips it up, signs it with, and now the requirement is to sign it with, a custom domain that is aligned with your sending domain. So if you're sending from domain, if you're sending from InboxArmy.com, your DKIM signature needs to either be on, your DKIM signing domain that is stamped in the message by the MTA needs to either be a subdomain of InboxArmy.com or InboxArmy.com proper. And it honestly doesn't generally matter unless you've configured the next one, DMARC, differently. So DMARC is a bit different than, because it's a little less about securing and it's more about, well, it protects your domain against spoofing. It allows you to publish a policy and give instructions to mailbox providers. So I've always been a big fan of DMARC since it really started since it really started coming on several years ago, because I think it gets senders a really precious source of information, which is data directly from the mailbox providers. And there are precious few of those sources. Like, Google, we've got Google Postmaster tools, but it doesn't tell you the volumes. So I really like DMARC for tracking the volumes. But basically, DMARC just lets you specify, say, hey, if you put a DMARC policy on your domain, which Google now requires if you are a bulk sender, that it says, hey, if I don't have if the sends coming out, they need to pass either SPF or DKIM, and they also need to be aligned, which means, in the technical headers of the mail, that DKIM signature, that DKIM signing domain needs to align with whatever domain you're sending from, is the big thing. Okay. And that's what, jumping ahead to DMARC, that's what DMARC does. And you publish reporting addresses. For the love of everything, please route it into a reasonable reporting tool that is going to give you the ability to parse through the data, because it's not really possible to just like go through it by hand. Trust me, I've tried. It's not. It's more valuable when it's aggregated and collated versus all.
It's just XML files, right? And it's a whole bunch of. Yeah. It's like feedback loops on steroids. It's yeah.
Yeah, and it's and I was just looking at something today. So for like one sender, they were only sending like a few tens of thousands per day, and they had over 5,000 reports for like less than 30 days worth of sends. So you get a lot, because you're going to get one, if you send on the 1st of March and you send to Google and Yahoo and Hotmail and Comcast, you're going to get reports back from each of them. You're going to get at least one report back from each of them, if not more.
Wow. Well, and so there's levels of DMARC too, right? Because I think the minimum requirement right now is to set it to none, which is like the base level. And then there's quarantine and there's reject. What's that all about? What are the differences?
Totally. So DMARC, was designed by a working group that is involved with, I believe, the Internet Engineering Task Force. They're the fine folks that have given us, that have codified basically all of the protocols by which like the modern internet works, and they will publish, documents that are like, hey, here's how this thing works. They're often called RFCs, or request for comments. But yeah, they're the ones that publish, hey, this is how SPF works. This is how you technically implement it. This is how DKIM works, etc. So, the different policy, they designed this to work for senders of all sizes. Because if you're a really large sender, you don't just want to put your DMARC policy to reject. What the different policies are is none, quarantine. Oh, where's my hand? There we go. One, none, quarantine, and reject. And you're designed to kind of step through them, but I'll say in the majority of cases, that's not necessary. It really depends. I think quarantine is only situationally very useful, whereas none is saying, hey, mailbox provider, if my message fails DMARC, I don't want you to do anything different about it. I still just want you to send me the reports. Recently on a webinar, where both Marcel from Yahoo and also the product lead for anti-abuse at Google showed up and said, really that basically, none policy is what we call reporting mode. So, he did say if you have your policy set to none, that's telling them you're focusing on the R in DMARC, which stands for reporting. So you need to have an RUA, an aggregate, reporting address configured in there, and highly recommend it routing into an account or into a platform that is going to like make that make that information human readable versus just machine readable for you. And then the quarantine mode is basically saying, hey, if I send you a message, if you receive a message from my domain and it fails, what I want you to do is put it in the quarantine folder, which could be, at Google, that could be more like they're going to put it in spam. The spam and quarantine folder might be synonymous, but with business mailbox providers, they actually have quarantine folders that like kind of only the IT team has access to. And it's before it even gets to the user's individual mailbox. This is the reason I don't like quarantine mode. This is my soapbox, because I feel like it gets you no information. Because your mail provider, your email platform will tell you, yep, that mail successfully delivered. It was accepted. But then the user might be like, well, I never got it in the recipient will be like, I never got it in my mailbox. That's because it's chilling in the quarantine folder that only the IT team has access to, only the spam filter admin. And I can tell you, as someone who started on the IT side, internal IT side of the house, we never check those things pretty much. So the likelihood any message that lands in quarantine is ever released is pretty low. And then reject is telling the mailbox providers, hey, if a message is not authenticated properly, it does not have the necessary alignment to pass DMARC, I want you to bounce it back. And I'm a big fan of this. What I like to typically do for DMARC deployments, we do a lot of them, and I've been doing lots of them for years, is start in the none mode. Just focus on getting the reporting. And the reporting, when you have it routed into a platform and you're able to analyze it, you can identify mail streams that are possibly, out of alignment. It's like maybe they're passing. It is a platform that you use. I'll say sender, e-commerce, like we both have done a lot of work there. I know. I mean, I've seen small businesses that on top of Shopify using Klaviyo, but also with a bunch of kind of add-ons like to manage other things like shipping and customer support and generating user-generated content reviews, things like that. Sometimes maybe those miss getting set up for authenticate, for custom DKIM signing to be DMARC compliant. And then DMARC reporting will let you identify those and then go identify the platform and be like, okay, let me contact this platform and correct my authentication. And then once you're properly hardened, you've got everything down, you've got a process, and everybody knows, hey, if you want to onboard a new email sending platform, anything that might send email on behalf of our domain, you got to go to IT because they have DNS access. They functionally own the domain, and you got to get them to set up the DNS records to do custom DKIM signing or custom SPF or both.
Excellent. So it sounds like there are sort of varying levels of complexity from one level of authentication to the next. But most importantly, what I'm hearing from you is that the most critical factor is to make sure when setting up, you're doing it absolutely correctly and sort of, no typos, no mistakes. Everything is exactly as it should be. So I guess, for the curious out there, where do folks go to set this up? What is actually managed by their ESP, their email service provider, and what is managed by their IT team? What's the division of labor and task ownership there?
Gotcha, totally. So as we were talking earlier about what happens when I press send, so what your email service provider, they will provide, if they want to be able to send on behalf of your domain and represent you and be DMARC compliant, they're going to need to hand you some DNS records. Typically, these are text records. They can also be CNAME records. Both ways of doing this are valid and have their advantages and disadvantages, though I see the CNAME method of ESP authentication really picking up. I think that's been very heavily pushed or very heavily pioneered kind of by SendGrid, or at least that's where I've seen kind of the most of it. And that allows the service provider to manage things more seamlessly for you. So if anything changes on their end, you don't have to make changes on yours. They can just update the reference. But typically your email team, your IT team is going to be the one to deploy the DNS records. Now, there are exceptions to this, but typically if you want to authorize a platform to send mail on your behalf, definitely going to have your IT team deploy some DNS records. And it's just, honestly, it's generally really pretty quick. I like just copy pasting because, like you said, it's super important to not make any typos or mistakes or anything. So big fan of copy paste. Don't try to hand type anything because some of this stuff can get really there's this two letters and 4 random numbers and don't stress yourself out. But also always check your work. It's really easy to check your work. I mean, what I always do, the easiest way to check it is I will send myself to my Gmail box, and then Gmail has on desktop only, doesn't work on mobile, but on desktop you can go into the 3 dots menu and go down to the option that says show original, and they have a nice little grid that will show SPF passed with this IP address, DKIM passed with this domain, DMARC passed or failed. And it'll give you the readout right there. It's super easy, and then you can just be boom, it's done. So while it's important not to make mistakes, it doesn't have to be catastrophic, as long as you're properly implementing IT change management, because it is, there are, changing the DNS, if you aren't certain what you're doing, or if it's improperly managed, there are some risks to that. There are definitely some risks, but they're easily managed.
Another reason to copy paste.
Yeah, exactly.
Another reason to copy paste. So you go, IT goes, what do you need? Oh, it's this. You just copy and paste it over, right? You don't. Yeah, it's. Yeah. I'll just say it to you, and they'll be like, no, don't just type it. Just type it. No. Copy paste. Yeah.
Yeah. And we're seeing some cool solutions in the marketplace pop up too that are streamlining this even further. That honestly is something that I've been working with recently, but I don't want to. We'll have to save that for the update podcast because I haven't got all my code done yet. So,
well, we'll definitely have to come back to that for sure. All right, so we talked about technical stuff. Let's talk about the term that I've heard I've had to do email one-on-ones where I had to try to explain this to people that had no clue about it. Sender reputation. What is sender reputation and what goes into it?
So, I mean, frankly, sender reputation is, I would say it's really, the best way I can describe it is with an analogy, which is it's very similar to consumer credit scoring, right? So you have all of us pretty much have a credit score here in the US. And that is a rating of our credit worthiness, essentially. How risky is it to lend money to this individual? The way this works in email with sender reputation is how risky is it to accept mail from this sender? from this IP address, from this domain, to accept this particular piece of content and serve it up to the user. It's basically, again, risk. It's a, if you're sending from IPs that have a really low sender score, that indicates that the mailbox providers involved in that data partnership think that those IPs are risky to accept mail from. So they've started probably rejecting a lot of it. And the same if in Google Postmaster tools, if you look and you have a bad domain reputation, that's an indication Google thinks it's risky to accept any mail from your domain. And the difficult part, I think, it was when it comes to credit limit or how much mail you can inbox, because there's definitely, this is why we have to do warm-ups, is essentially to expand your credit limit at Google, at Yahoo, at Hotmail, how much mail do they think you're good to inbox per day? And that's basically a function of your historical send volume and behaviors. Do you generate a lot of spam complaints? That makes you look risky. Do you bounce a lot of mail? Do you, try a lot of addresses that just frankly don't exist? Or does it look like you're guessing at someone's address, right? All of these things bake into essentially deliver an invisible, in most cases, assessment of your send worthiness rather than credit worthiness into various different receiving mail systems.
If someone has garnered a negative or disfavorable sender reputation, obviously remediation, we could do an entirely different or entirely separate podcast on that one alone. But what I often see or sometimes see with clients is their immediate sort of method of remediation is to leave their current ISP and spin up new IP addresses with a new ESP. What's the typical result there that you see most often, LB, when people are sort of taking those types of shortcuts?
So, I mean, typically what I've seen recently is those shortcuts are just not working anymore. Because the thing you have to understand, really, the spam filters are most concerned with screening out the worst of the worst, right? Like the really actively malicious content. So if you engage in any behaviors that senders trying to inbox malicious content have done, like snowshoeing, i.e., oh, well, these IPs stopped working, so I'm just going to change them. Or this domain stopped working, I'm just going to change it. That inherently makes you look similar to malicious actors, and it will get you treated as such. So what I'll see is either just depending on how many times they've tried this trick, I'll see just a complete failure to launch, or I'll see like it'll work for a little minute and then it'll stop. Because if you don't solve the root problem of whatever tanked the reputation in the first place, it's just going to keep cropping back up. And they're, especially with, how advanced machine learning is getting and how much data Google has. I estimate they have approximately more than half of probably all the web data in the world, and email data in the world. Because with all the sites they index with Google search and all the mail they receive and even the mail they bounce, they got a lot of data points and a lot of intelligence baked into that. So what I've seen is you'll just get identified more and more quickly. Google, this has been my thing. Google and the mailbox providers, the spam filters, they don't have to make it impossible to game the system. They just have to make it unprofitable. They just have to make it more trouble than it's worth to try to go around the filter. But I can almost guarantee anything that anybody, any business person can kind of think of off the top of their dome to get around a spam filter has already been tried by hackers en masse. Like, hackers have probably already tried it and ruined it for everyone.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Well, and you talk about just making it non-profitable and just, the goalposts keep moving, right? And the thresholds get tighter, especially now with spam complaints.
Yeah.
What the complaints I've heard, was it 0.1% is kind of like hey, watch out, and 0.3 is you're in trouble. Now obviously if it happens once they're not going to throw you in jail, but it's about consistency, right? Like reputation's the same way, it's all about consistency. But what
Yeah.
what are you seeing in terms of enforcement? I mean, it's still early. This is, end of February or early March when we're recording this, so it's still early, but what are you seeing in terms of enforcement?
So the interesting thing is, Google actually jumped the gun on enforcement about a week prior to February. We actually started seeing bounce backs referring to DMARC alignment um, uh, as early as January 25th. That we're saying, and really, it's just a partial block. Right now, they're blocking, or they're soft bouncing a temporary bouncing a portion of your traffic that is unaligned. What I have also seen is a new bounce at Google that references spammy content. And it's also a new error in Google Postmaster tools that I had not seen before that says, like delivery error, spammy content. And I did unfortunately have a sender, an ESP client recently that I was assisting, that they got a new sender, and yeah, everything got blocked at Google. So basically, if you build up a content fingerprint with, if you build up a content fingerprint that is known for generating a high spam complaint rate, even if you switch platforms, Google's going to see it and they're going to block it. They're going to be like, I don't want to receive that. Now, in this particular case, the issue has been getting resolved. It turns out there was just an insecure link in the email. So I think that's honestly, I think kind of what's going on at Google and Yahoo is really they're cleaning noise out of the data set. They basically said, yo, DMARC has been in the wild for several years now. It's a best practice. It helps centralize control of the domain with IT so that, changes all have to be duly authorized and go through change management to be put into place. And so they're basically, I've seen Google in the past inbox mail that was failing every authentication parameter right in the primary tab because they're like, well, we just know this sender just hasn't set the system up to authenticate properly, but these are actually their transactional mails. And we know LB really wants to get, this password reset or this one-time passcode or this, discount code for the e-com site she's shopping on currently, right? So they would inbox that. They're not going to do that anymore. So the first, they're bringing down the hammer on authentication, and that cleans a lot of the noise out of the data set so that they can focus on user behavior more. Like for the mail they're accepting, what is truly desired, what tab should it go in, and like what, whether or should we even accept it or not. And I think that's really actually the really cool thing from the webinar with Google and Yahoo that Mailgun put on was they said it's actually not a change as far as the spam complaint rates. It's actually them just being more transparent about what has kind of been the law of the land for a while now. And the way I like to think about it, because I think 0.1%, 0.3%, I think those are so like academic. I think we say that and we don't even conceptualize it really.
Yeah.
The way I like to look at it is 1 per 1,000. Think about that. If 1 per 1,000 people is marking your message as marking your messages as spam, that's kind of a lot if you think about it really, especially if you're sending millions and millions of messages.
Yeah.
And the same with 0.3, that's 3 per 1,000. I mean, you got to think about it. If you hit a 1% complaint rate, that's 10 people per 1,000 that are like, yo, I hate this. Why did you send me this? Like, so that's kind of, I think that's the thing. And the big thing, I should also point out, and I've seen this for years, is, what kind of spam rate at least Google will tolerate from your mail streams is dependent on a couple of things. The scale, because the bigger a scale you're at, the larger of a risk you are. Because you're shipping a lot more mail into their platform. You're a bigger risk. And the other thing they look at is the positive engagement you're generating. So because I've seen senders like who have really crazy good positive engagement. Maybe they're getting primary tab placement. I see this with a lot of newsletters I've worked with. Also, sometimes like welcome emails from e-commerce, just because the engagement is so fire. People want that discount, that they got, that the attentive pop-up told them they were gonna get, and those will hit the primary tab. But primary tab placement typically does come with higher complaint and unsubscribe rates for sure. So that's really, but if you're generating crazy good engagement, you got like a 50-60% open rate, you got high click rates, Google might say, yeah, I'll tolerate it. It just depends. But again, depends on your scale. If you're if you're in the millions, or you're a super sender doing like $1 billion plus a month, they're not going to tolerate as much nonsense. And typically those senders that I've worked with, the real big dogs, they're at like 1 complaint per 10,000, like, or less in most cases.
LB, given the threshold for spam is so low, the 0.1%, academic or otherwise, right? I think about an unfortunate yet prevalent fact about human behavior, and that's that many of us are lazy. And I've seen many, many instances, and I've been guilty of it myself in the past. Rather than go through what may be a multi-click unsubscribe process, I might be tempted to just click the report as spam button, right? Apply a little Occam's razor there. How can we encourage marketers to put in place any type of method, or what tactics can they use to sort of negate that, or at least minimize the risk of folks sort of unsubscribing through spam complaints, if that makes sense?
Oh, I mean, honestly, make it easy to unsubscribe. This has been the best practice like forever. Scott, I think I saw one of your presentations once where you were talking about this like years ago. Make it easy to unsubscribe, make it intuitive. And this is also being mandated now by Google. And Yahoo. Part of the changes are you have to have a one-click unsubscribe, which is the list unsubscribe, list dash unsubscribe header. And it needs to be HTTPS, very important. That is a secure link. And also very important, it is a one-click unsubscribe. And that is what gets utilized by Google to power their unsubscribe button in the platform. Apple as well. I believe Yahoo has it as well. So it's really that one-click. So really it has to be one click is a requirement of the list header unsubscribe, and that's not visible typically. Most people, that's something your ESP is going to manage for you. They're going to construct that, and you should just ask them, if you're RFPing or if you have any questions, reach out to your ESP and ask them, hey, is this something you're putting in? Is the one click unsubscribe button, is the link secure and functional basically? But I think that's really it. That's a good way, because I've heard people before say, oh, put the unsubscribe at the top, but I think that of the mail body, I think that can be a little off-putting in a lot of cases, and I think it's not always necessary. But also make it very clear at the bottom, the footer of the email, that's kind of the standard. Make sure you have the unsubscribe link also in the body of the email, but that one is not mandated to be a one click. But I think that's also where you really have to go, well, if I'm having a spam complaint problem and I don't have a one click unsubscribe in the body of the email, maybe I should test that. Because that's the best way to know anything in email is to test it.
Agreed.
Absolutely.
Well, let's talk about the future. The future,
Awesome.
Conan. Sorry. Shows my nerddom a little bit.
In
Next 12 to 24.
2000.
Exactly. In the year 2000. What's coming in the next 12 to 24 months? What? I mean, obviously the Gmail and Yahoo stuff's kind of the big thing, even though it's really not a big thing. It's just, again, it's the flashing light is over deliverability at the moment. But what is coming? What do you see, both good, bad, ugly, whatever it might be? What is coming down the pipe for us?
Absolutely. I've kind of alluded to this a little. I think, the major mailbox providers dropping the kind of authentication hammer on a larger swath of senders, because singular large senders, the Home Depots and Fords and Toyotas of the world and stuff like that, they've had this buttoned down for years. They've got it. They got big IT teams. They've got this all buttoned down, right? Their DMARC and their change management process and onboarding new sending platforms, things like that. But they don't, as was pointed out on the Google and Yahoo webinar, that's only like 20% of all traffic or something like that, So there's still a lot of small, medium senders out there that this now applies to. So I think it is kind of a big thing. And it's basically saying, no, you really need to have this if you want us to take you serious, like from the jump. You need to start with your mail properly authenticated. And I think that is allowing them to focus more on content filtering. I have absolutely seen a rise in content filtering. And I think it's a response to what Garen said as far as, oh, well, what if a sender, they just change their IPs, they change their domain, whatever. I think the increased focus on content filtering is due to that, to be able to identify where the same or similar content is being sent from numerous different platforms, domains, and IPs, and being able to identify that content and blocking it. Consequently, I have significant concerns about AI being able to break that content fingerprinting. Because if you think about it, with AI, you can generate novel content for every user in a 1 million person list. Possibly, you could have AI, say, hey, give me a 1 million different ways to say this one thing, or here are the data points I have on this subscriber, make the most convincing email possible to ask, to get them to buy whatever my new product offering is as a business. And with all those really novel contents flying around, and they're may possibly distinct from each other, I think that's going to make the content filtering more difficult in some ways. Now, there are other things that a lot of people don't think about, like for canned spam compliance, you have to put your physical business address in the footer. Well, that can be pattern matched with software. Like that's a regular pattern. Heaven forbid I invoke the specter of regular expressions. I've had to work in regex a few times, and I've hated it every time. But essentially, I think there are biases in the spam filters based on what they're most easily able to identify and filter. URLs are huge for content filtering. I probably bring this up every time I say content filtering, but Vitis has a really, Vitis M, and I'm not going to try to kill his last name, has a really good article on LinkedIn that was published years ago, but it's still super relevant, called Content Isn't King, It's the Vizier of Email. And it talks about, but it goes really in depth to about how URLs matter so much in content filtering. And I've absolutely, across tons of tests, inbox placement tests, and data points, I've seen this to be true. So really, the reputation of whatever websites you link into the body of the email, you could be just fine. But if you put a bit.ly link in there, well, bit.ly has been used for a long time to hide viruses behind it, because you don't know what's behind the link. And it's a public link shortener. So link shorteners inherently aren't bad, but public ones are, because anybody can use that domain and put anything behind it. So I think that's, but I think the other thing is I've seen a real rise. I've been helping with a lot of ESPs with deliverability architecture, email architecture, and advisory lately, and I've seen lots of niche ESPs that handle a particular mail stream or a particular industry type of mail that are often powered by AI to take effort off of email marketing teams. Because I don't think I've ever met an email marketer who said they weren't busy. Every email marketer I know is typically about, the clock is like it's 5 minutes to midnight. They've got 80 million things they're trying to get done in not nearly enough time. And I think, so we're seeing a lot of these niche ESPs pop up and leverage AI. And I think it's a natural evolution. And I think these kind of almost expert systems for sending mail, as I would call them, are going to help with contextualization and kind of personalization of the mail in a lot of ways. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how kind of the increased focus, the lens on content filtering interacts with these AI generated emails. I think it's going to be really, that's going to be something we're going to have to see how that plays out.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's whenever I get asked about AI, my concern is, at least right now, my concern is mediocrity. The curse of good enough. Like, the 5 minutes to midnight, you just have to get something out the door. So is it good enough to get out the door? And so there's always, I think, at least for now, there's certainly always going to be a human element. There should be anyway. But it's like, you think about 99% of email doesn't get delivered. The 1% that does get delivered is a huge amount. So you're competing against everything anyway. And it's just hard. It's just hard. Let's just face it. It's hard.
Email is hard because there's so much that has to go right. And kind of one of the things when I'm talking to ESPs that I'm helping them make decisions on how to use like the underlying MTAs or email platforms they're relying on, it's like there's unfortunately not a lot. There's not a right answer on how to do something. There's like, well, it really depends based on what you're trying to achieve, what your app functionality is, etc. There's a lot of wrong answers. There's a lot of ways to mess up an email and cause, like I said, you can do everything right. You can have all your authentication, but maybe you put your links in, the links are HTTP instead of HTTPS. But I think really what we're seeing with Google and Yahoo and this big push for authentication is an increased focus on security, because email has just, again, it as you said, 99% gets rejected. That's a lot of it's very malicious traffic. There's lots of infected documents, all kinds of scams and ways to try to get around that. I've seen people leverage Google Docs emails to try to inbox malicious content, Google Calendar notifications, out of office bounce backs. I mean, there's like so many ways that malicious actors are trying to get these virus laden emails kind of in over the eaves.
So I would say all these changes are good, right? Would you say all these changes are good? Like, obviously we've had a little bit of an influx in turn, like we've seen it and you guys have seen it too. I'd imagine of, oh my God, I got to get DMARC set up, but it's all good, right?
Oh yeah. I think ultimately it is great for the email ecosystem as a whole, because that's what maintains email's relevance as a communication channel. If you think about it, if email as a whole was just super unreliable and you were really likely, you're half as likely to get a virus versus a discount on any email that you open, email would not be relied upon. Because look at what's happening with SMS and telecom. Like, we get all these spam calls. I don't know anybody anymore that just picks up their phone. Everybody I know screens all their calls. And that's a spam filter. That's like a spam filter, and it's a very manual spam filter. And the same with SMS. Like, SMS doesn't have tabs. It just goes, it dings your phone. And there's not as much filtering, so it can be very noisy and intrusive. But I think really that the filtering is what I think improve filtering and improve security protections, especially because getting hacked is a real bad experience, and like that is something that's going to stick in someone's mind forever. So, really protecting them against that is what maintains email's relevance as a channel. And the great thing is, it's an order of magnitude cheaper than just about anything else, any other push communication medium you could, engage in.
Well, I think that's a great spot to stop, because we could go for another hour or 2 hours.
Oh, God,
it's we're just touching the nerddom, so we could totally go deeper. But you know what, LB, where can people find out more about you and about email industries?
Yeah, hit us up on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn as LB Blair. email ecosystem expert, email industries. We're on LinkedIn. Also, our website, you can come through there. I also hang out in the Email Geeks Deliverability channel. So, feel free to hit me up and be like, I summon you. I'm happy to answer questions and help out where I can. Going to Inbox Expo, I'll be presenting there an update on what we're seeing at a data level from Google and Yahoo. Also, the Deliverability Summit in Amsterdam. Really looking forward to that. And actually just added to the slate, I will be teaching a masterclass on the email ecosystem with the Email Roadshow in Atlanta at likely my university, Georgia State. So I'm super pleased about being able to teach a class without having without having gotten a master's degree yet. So
very nice. Well, thank you for joining us, LB, and thanks to you listeners and watchers for tuning in. If you'd like to learn more about us at InboxArmy, check us out at InboxArmy.com. Till next time, be safe and be well.